Got me?
Testing.
Testing 1, 2. Testing, testing. Sound check 1, 2. 1, 2, 3.
Test, test. Test, test. Testing. Test, test. Not yellow is on.
I feel like
Test.
subcommittee will come to order. I want to welcome everyone to today's hearing on the fiscal year 2020 President's Budget Request for the Department of Defense Science and Technology Programs. I'm pleased that for the first time in many Congresses, we have the highest S&T leadership from the Department providing testimony. By having the top leadership, this hearing aims to elevate the discussion of S&T to the same level of importance as to how many fighters, ships, and satellites the Department is buying. The Department's S&T ecosystem is complex and comprises agencies, offices, laboratories, federally funded research and development centers, university-affiliated research centers, academic partnerships, tests and evaluation entities, and partnerships with the private sector, including small businesses. This S&T ecosystem is charged with delivering the best capabilities to the warfighter in the near, mid, and long term. For such an important portfolio, the FY20 President's Budget Request totals $14.5 billion, which is only 2.7% of the Department's base budget and only 3.2% above the FY19 requested funding level. Adjusted for inflation, the FY20 request is only 1% higher despite the increasing cost escalation of highly specialized technical labor like scientists and engineers with advanced degrees and PhDs. To say it another way, normalizing for inflation and labor cost escalation, this S&T budget has effectively been shrinking for years. And this is the budget that must lay the groundwork for today, for our future technological edge in the next 10 to 20 years. I also want to point out that unlike the shrinking of the S&T request, the Department's FY20 investment in advanced component development and prototypes funding grew by 5.8% from the FY19 request, or by 27%. Although I strongly support efforts to get new technologies across the Valley of Death into the hands of our service members as soon as possible, we must be cognizant of the fact that we must also invest in the long-term basic and early-stage applied research that will allow for revolutionary advancements down the line. In the past 3 National Defense Authorization Act alone, Congress has granted almost 24 authorities to improve the Department's S&T workforce, facilities, and infrastructure to champion in-house innovation for the future of force modernization, warfighting, operational concepts, and acquisition. I remain disappointed that many of those authorities have been gone underutilized or unused by the Department. This is also hard to reconcile with the National Defense Strategy, which highlights long-term strategic competition with China and Russia and the need for unparalleled national security innovation base. It is no secret that China is stealing our intellectual property to further their objective to be a research and engineering powerhouse and compromise our warfighting edge. Make no mistake about it, however, China is not the only nation conducting these types of activities. China is, though, one of the few state actors that has coupled such tactics with considerable investments and resources behind a national strategy that involves a whole-of-government effort and leverages society to promote indigenous innovation. Yet the President's budget request decreases S&T and R&D funding across the executive agencies, including the Department of Energy's Office of Science and the National Institute of Standards and Technology and the National Science Foundation. If the U.S. is to remain a global leader in technology, we cannot simply play defense. We must also play offense. Investments in science and research and other development efforts across the whole of government are necessary and vital to maintaining a technological edge. So, beyond the R&D specific funding, we must also invest in STEM education, programs that develop junior talent into future tech leaders and implement policies that promote a sound economic, political, and strategic environment on U.S. soil where global collaboration, discovery, innovation, and public institutions and industry can thrive. I recognize that the open dialogue and debate of academia can be anathema to the secrecy we rely on in the Department of Defense. But we must also recognize and embrace the competitive advantage our free society gives us to out-innovate and develop better products faster than anyone else in the world. Setting ourselves apart from our strategic competitors also means abiding by our American values and keeping our policy as or more developed than the technology itself. Functional work for the current understanding of artificial intelligence done in the 1950s and 60s was funded by DARPA and the Office of Naval Research and aided by the convening power of universities. Now, we've been working on this technology for over half a century. Yet, in the John S. McCain FY19 NDAA, Congress had to create a National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence to expedite the policy, strategy, and implementation plan that absolutely must be thought through for our nation to effectively and ethically use these capabilities. For AI and for each of the other 7 rapid technological advancements outlined in the NDS, I'm looking to the Department to lean forward on strategically developing policies on how we should use and deploy those future technologies and how these emerging capabilities will contribute to our new national strategies, our new security strategies. Such effort is especially important with hypersonics and directed energy, which present a myriad of policy and political considerations and challenges. Finally, I must emphasize that we will not attain the technological edge we need if we refuse to take risks in our R&D portfolio and if we do not empower risk takers who are willing to push the boundaries on innovation. I realize that this will not come easily for the Department of Defense because the overriding culture is one of never failing. After all, in many aspects of the Department's mission, failure means people will die. However, in the S&T space, an attitude that conservative means we will never conceive of the technological leaps that will ensure our warfighters never go into a fair fight is incumbent upon the leadership in the Department to avoid perpetuating an overly conservative culture in the S&T enterprise. And I hope to hear from our witnesses today what they are doing to encourage reasonable risk-taking. In turn, so long as the Department is transparent about such failures, Congress, and this subcommittee in particular, must be willing to provide top cover for those that fail fast, fail smart, fail forward, and internalize the lessons learned from those failures. So before us today, we have the services technology and acquisition executives. These individuals must divide their attention between fielding the best technology to the warfighters as quickly as and as effectively and efficiently as possible in the near and the midterm, and protecting the scientists and innovators working on the next generation of S&T that will enable the Department to keep its technological edge over the long term. In Section 901 of the FY17 NDAA, Congress split the former Undersecretary of Acquisition Technology and Logistics into 2 and created the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering to empower Department leadership to drive towards better innovation, advancing science and technology, and reducing risk and tolerance in the pursuit of new technologies. Dr. Griffin, the first USD R&E since its charge, is the Chief Technology Officer for the Department and is responsible for the research, development, and prototyping activities across the DoD enterprise. He is mandated with ensuring technological superiority for the Department of Defense. Dr. Bruce Jetty, the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology. Mr. James Hondo Gertz, the Assistant Secretary of Navy for Research, Development, and Acquisition, and Dr. Will Roper, Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, are the 3 service acquisition executives responsible for executing and overseeing the services research, development, and acquisition activities. So I welcome you all here today. I look forward to hearing from witnesses on the FY20 S&T request, and note that following this discussion, we will continue to closed classified session following our discussion with representation across the spectrum of the S&T ecosystem the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the Department's laboratories and academic partnerships, the Strategic Capabilities Office, and the Defense Innovation Unit. So with that, I'll now turn it over to Ranking Member Stefanik for her remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Langevin, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I want to stress how important our investment in science and technology and the innovation ecosystem is to our national and economic security. The National Defense Strategy framed the current security environment as one of, quote, rapid technological advancements that is changing the character of war, end quote. Now, more than any time in recent history, our military superiority is determined by our technological superiority. We are entering a new era of strategic competition where our ability to harness the power of our innovation ecosystem is being challenged by our adversaries. I am concerned that our S&T investments represent an alarmingly small percentage of our overall defense budget and a shrinking percentage of our total RDT&E budget, and at the same time that our adversaries are significantly increasing their S&T spending. While I am encouraged by the Department's investment in near-term advanced component development and prototyping, this cannot come at the expense of DoD's investment in our future. A properly resourced S&T enterprise reduces risk and technological surprise, and when properly executed, can generate disruptive new technologies that transform the way the Department does business, deters conflict, and wages war. I also want to highlight the importance of basic research to our future military capabilities. In fact, at a hearing I chaired in December on artificial intelligence, Dr. Lisa Porter cited DoD's 40 years of funding of AI basic research as the single most important factor for why we still maintain a slight lead over China's AI capabilities. As the pressure grows to accelerate and apply new technologies to today's problems, we must continue to balance this with the investment in future R&D. Any degradation in our future R&D will put the U.S. at a competitive disadvantage 10 to 20 years from now and weaken the bench of domestic science and technology expertise, which is already, as we know, in very short supply. Now more than ever, our science and technology enterprise plays a strategic role that is fundamental to our national and economic security. We must invest in it, and we must also protect it. Industrial espionage, cyber theft on a massive scale, illicit technology transfer, and foreign influence on our campuses are just a few of the malicious practices that our adversaries, most notably China, are using to undermine our national and economic security. Our universities, service laboratories, research and development centers, and pioneering small businesses are particularly vulnerable in our democratic and open society. We must do more to educate, inform, and protect our defense innovation ecosystem from these threats, or we run the risk of arming our adversaries with technologies they will use against us in future conflicts. Finally, we cannot allow our own bureaucracy to constrain the services from acquiring new technologies or the talent needed to implement these breakthroughs. Congress has made strides over the last several years to provide flexibility to the Department in hiring, funding, and sustaining our science and technology enterprise. I'm particularly interested in understanding how these authorities are being utilized and what more we can do to improve our defense innovation ecosystem. Thank you again to our witnesses here today, and I yield back to the chair.
Thank you, Ranking Member Stefanik. I want to thank you for your remarks, and we'll now hear from our witnesses, then move to the question and answer session. With that, I'd like to now recognize Secretary Griffin for an opening statement. Microphone, please.
My error, thank you. Chairman Langevin, Ranking Member Stefanik, members of this subcommittee, I want to thank you for the opportunity to discuss the ways in which we're advancing defense modernization in response to the threats posed by our adversaries. I have a few brief opening remarks. I've submitted my written testimony. I'd like my written testimony to be entered in the record if you so approve.
Without objection, of course.
Thank you. I don't have to explain to this committee the threats that we face from Russia and China. Our adversaries have self-declared, and our only choice is to respond appropriately or to cede the primacy of the rules-based order that the United States established in the aftermath of World War II and has nurtured for now 3 full generations. Congress has paid very careful attention to these existential threats by our adversaries and has taken action to meet them. Through authorization law and funding, you've done your part to address these challenges, and we thank you for that support. For our part, we must work to change the processes, culture, and investment decisions of the DoD to regain and maintain the technical dominance that deters our adversaries. It is the role of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, working with the service acquisition executives who are here today, to align the department's investment portfolio to that end. The 2018 National Defense Strategy outlines a clear path to the technical advantage we seek. It prioritizes hypersonics, directed energy, space, autonomy, cybersecurity, quantum science, microelectronics, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, machine learning, network, command, control, and communication. This is a smorgasbord of items. All are important. To pursue these priorities, the President's FY20 budget includes $14.1 billion for cross-department science and technology. Our request for, as one example of what we're doing with this funding, our request for $2.6 billion for hypersonics in FY19 and our request for $11.2 billion over the next 5 years will allow us to increase flight testing and field operational capability years earlier than we had previously planned. DARPA continues to build on work begun almost 60 years ago with its $2 billion multi-year AI Next campaign. To respond to the adversarial activity we observed today by China and Russia in space, the Department has created the Space Development Agency to design and field critical space technologies more rapidly than has been the case recently. These are just a few of the ways in which we're pursuing defense modernization. We will not succeed by fighting tomorrow's conflicts with yesterday's weapons. It is not our goal merely to match those who reject the values we espouse and the freedoms we protect. Instead, we are working to build and sustain a level of dominance so overwhelming that no adversary will start a fight because they know they will lose. That's our goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Griffin. Now Secretary Jetty is recognized.
Chairman Langevin, Ranking Member Stefanik, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you to discuss the U.S. Army's program for science and technology for fiscal year 2020. The subcommittee's vital role in supporting Army S&T ensures the U.S. Army shall continue to modernize to meet future readiness requirements and counter emerging and future threats. As Secretary Esper discussed in testimony Tuesday of this week, Army Futures Command was formed to define the operational vision for multi-domain operations, identify the technology requirements near, mid, and far, and to provide management of the technology enterprise. Your demonstrated commitment to our program was clear in your support of our FY 2019 budget submission for $2.3 billion in S&T, which represented a stable inflation-adjusted growth and laid the foundation for closing critical technology gaps. Congress added $1.3 billion, allowing us to advance even further and faster as we focused on those technologies outlined in the NDS, some of which Dr. Griffin just mentioned, which will provide a decisive overmatch. Thank you for your support, and thank you for passing the budget in time for the fiscal year. The Army's FY20 budget request for $2.4 billion S&T again remains inflation growth protected. Approximately 83% is aligned with the Army's 6 modernization priorities focused on maturing technology, reducing program risk, developing prototypes to better define affordable and achievable requirements, and conduct experimentation with soldiers to refine new operational concepts. The Army's 12,000 civilians and scientists are critical assets in identifying, developing, demonstrating technologies, and leveraging more commercially based research and executing military-unique research. Through NDAA authorities, we have implemented a number of efforts to build, enhance, and retain our workforce, for which I would also like to thank you. The Army relies on its laboratories to foster innovation and help transition basic research. The laboratories directly support military operations through various services and limited product development and production. State-of-the-art facilities are imperative to the success of the Army, basic, applied, and advanced technology development and research. Chief among the reforms is the new intellectual property policy, which fosters greater communication with industry, researchers, and entrepreneurs early in the process, clarifying our data requirements, and I would say addressing some of the concerns of protecting the IP. Having patents and IP myself as a small entrepreneurial business owner only a year and a half ago, I know the important role IP plays in the ability to leverage the broader spectrum of cutting-edge technologies out there. With great support from the Secretary, we also are focusing on talent management in both our military and civilian workforces. Our labor system, our laboratory system has been leveraging those authorities you provided to recruit and retain top talent to keep the Army on the cutting edge. Grants, when combined with such efforts as open campus and industry outreach programs, have expanded the pool of exceptional talent to include 18 Nobel Prize winners and most recently the 2018 Nobel Prize in Chemistry, Dr. Francis Arnold. The Army continues to benefit from the many additional programs and has extended its outreach to non-traditional partners. Thank you again for strong support for the Army's programs, the authorities you provided, and the opportunity to discuss Army S&T. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Secretary Jetty. Secretary Gertz, you're welcome, recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Langevin, Ranking Member Stefanik, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thanks for the opportunity to appear before you today to address the Department of the Navy's science and technology efforts and how they support both the National Defense Strategy and, more importantly, our sailors and Marines. It's a really exciting time for our science and technology ecosystem, and it's truly my honor to be here to represent all of them with you today. I have a few brief opening comments, and then I request my full statement be entered into the record.
Without objection.
The Navy's 2020 budget request includes $2.3 billion in basic and applied research, which represents a key enabler to ensure the Department of the Navy maintains and expands its comparative overmatch against our competitors. It maintains our strong commitment to science and technology to further our advantage for our sailors and Marines. I'd like to thank the subcommittee and Congress for passing the fiscal year 2019 budget on time. On-time receipt of the full budget allowed us to expedite the delivery of technology, lethality, and readiness to our sailors and Marines while achieving cost savings through more efficient contracting. It also helped us accelerate our contracts to a broad network of science and technology partners in the ecosystem, including academia and small businesses, all of whom suffer disproportionately when we go into a continuing resolution period. I'd also like to thank Congress for the wide range of science and technologies authorities it's provided the Department of the Navy. Authorities such as Section 233 have allowed us to reduce our contracting timeline by over 27% in the first year alone and saved us over 154,000 processing days. Section 219 authorities have allowed us to invest an additional $250 million annually in science and technology workforce development programs, basic and applied research, technology transition, and facility revitalization. These authorities are remarkable and are really making a difference to ensure we can both recapitalize our capital assets as well as focus on our priority, which are our people. For the 18th year in a row, the Navy has led all government agencies in the number of patents, thanks largely to these authorities. As we continue to leverage these authorities and increase our iteration speed, we're also executing innovative and sustainable business and architectural strategies so that the discoveries made in S&T have a quick fast lane to get deployed to the field. Ensuring this clear fast lane from discovery to deployment allows us to harness the amazing science and technology discoveries into rapidly fielded capabilities so we can maintain and grow our advantage. Winning in a great competition requires us to maximize all the assets we have and derive the most value we can from the taxpayers' dollars. I would like to recognize the strong collaboration and teamwork we have achieved across the services and with Dr. Griffin. We are working very closely together, learning from each other removing redundancies, and allowing us to accelerate capabilities to the field for all of our services. Thanks for the strong support this subcommittee has always provided our sailors and Marines, and thanks for the opportunity to appear before you today. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Secretary Gertz. Dr. Roper, you are now recognized.
Chairman Langevin and Ranking Member Stefanik and members of the committee, thank you very much for holding a hearing on this very important topic. Mr. Chairman, you hit it on the head. Science and technology needs to be more important to us if we're going to keep the military edge that we've enjoyed from the last century into this one. I've prepared a written statement. I asked that it be entered into the record, but I'm just going to give some brief oral remarks if that's okay.
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, preparing for an S&T hearing is really good for the soul. It gives you a chance to drill down to what people are doing in our laboratories and in small business work. It's amazing to see the broad array of ideas that are being cultivated by our scientists and engineers, and it makes you excited about what the future is going to be for the Air Force. A lot of the technology areas you know, hypersonics and directed energy and space, we talk about these a lot, and they're critically important to us. But it's fun to discover some things you didn't know, like the Air Force is looking at bio-inspired materials that will let us make sensors inspired by geckos' ears, making them smaller and more compact. Or that we're using centuries-old ideas about origami to make antennas that can fold up and deploy in space. Cool ideas that are being developed across the country. And these are just a few of the things that I enjoyed seeing in my prep. Our science and technology budget is at $2.8 billion for this year, up 6% from last. We certainly hope to do better in the future, but this shows the commitment that the Air Force has to maintaining investment in science and technology so that the future Air Force remains dominant. Our Secretary is conducting a full review of science and technology in her 2030 study. We expect the results will be announced in the next couple of weeks, but expect sweeping reforms in how we address this critical part of the Air Force. Everyone has hit in this opening part of the hearing the most important thing we have to bring to this portfolio, and that is a competitive mindset. This is not broadcasting seeds that we can't carefully tend. This must be the place where we grow technologies that our future airmen and the services who rely on them will depend upon. We must treat it more strategically and make each day count. We have to compete for talent, and this subcommittee and Congress have given us the authorities to do that, but we need to use them more aggressively. Whether it's direct hire authority or direct hire for STEM, enhanced pay authority. The Air Force has gotten out of the starting blocks using them, but we need to fully use the authority to make sure that our laboratories are staffed by people that are world leading. But we can't just compete inside our laboratory walls. We need to get outside of them. We're part of a much broader technology ecosystem. We're expanding our work with universities, having fully embedded laboratory personnel on site, using the university as a place that conducts research just as if it was part of a government facility. Universities like Purdue have helped us on hypersonics, creating higher Mach wind tunnels where we can do cutting-edge research. New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology is working with us on electronic warfare, and we are in discussions with MIT on an AI center so that we leverage the best that universities bring. We have to acknowledge that the world is changing. Technology is not being developed just inside of government facilities. We have to understand that universities as well as commercial startups play an increasingly larger role in this ecosystem. We have focused very hard this year on making it easy for tech innovators to work with us, lowering the contracting time from months down to being able to have a company pitch to us, approve their idea, put them on contract, and pay them in less than 15 minutes. We have to have competitive speed given the competition for ideas in the technology world. But it's not just the kinds of technologies you might think about, AI, bio, that we're seeing. Small businesses can now play an increasing role in high-end technology development. One of our small businesses has been awarded the first X-plane designation ever given to a small business. It's the X-60 Alpha, which is a reusable hypersonic testbed, will allow us to collect better data to infuse back into fundamental research. Pretty awesome a small business is doing that for us. We also have to compete ideas. There are so many technologies that could change the future military: AI, autonomy, quantum, directed energy. So we need to make sure that ideas are not just peanut buttered across everything, but are strategically placed on capability areas that will be war-winning. We've created new programs like Skyborg to make artificial intelligence real, not just a laboratory demonstration, fieldable, usable AI. We're working on collaborative weapons so that we get the benefit of networking that so many of us experience in our everyday lives. And there are many more examples that I'm sure we'll discuss today. Ranking Member Stefanik, you used a really good word in your opening remarks. You used the word ecosystem. And it's a nice sounding word. But if you think about it, an ecosystem is not a very hospitable place. It's people competing for scarce resources that can be used by all. We need to think of ourselves as part of an ecosystem where we can play a valuable role to universities and businesses and government facilities in this country, but where those same technologies can be enjoyed by our adversaries and used against us. And it has to be our sacred duty to plant seeds in today's budget that will be reaped by those that come after us. Thank you.
Thank all of our witnesses. We're going to go to questions now, and then followed by the closed session. My first question is for all of our witnesses. The department has advertised that this is the largest RDT&E budget in some time, and yet the S&T request that we're here to talk about today, which includes activities in 6.1, 6.2, and 6.3, has effectively decreased in buying power. S&T is seen as the source of future innovations, essential to the United States' ability to compete with near-peer adversaries. If adjusted to account for inflation and highly skilled labor cost escalation for scientists and engineers, then if you look at it, the department has been on an overall downward trend in its S&T budget. Conversely, the department's FY20 request for advanced component development and prototypes 6.4 funding grew by $5.8 billion from the FY19 request, or by 27%. So I'm certainly a supporter of prototyping and risk-taking, but we also need to invest in our future science and technology. So given the new challenges on the horizon and the promise of powerful emerging technologies, why should we be effectively decreasing investments in DoD S&T? Dr. Riffin, let's start with you, and I'd like to have comment from all of our witnesses on this topic.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Well, I cannot argue with your figures. You're, of course, correct. I will note that many of the scientists and engineers to whom you refer can work across the boundaries of 6.1, 6.2, 6.3, 6.4. So I don't think our individual talent pool is at risk because of the prioritization that we're doing. And if you look at RDT&E as a global enterprise, from 6.1 through 6.7, we're actually up across base and OCA. We're up 9%, and across base alone, we're up over 8%. So I prefer. I do very much understand your point about the difference between S&T and prototyping. I do tend to look at the RDT&E enterprise as a continuous stream, and in that sense, we are up. So I'll stop there and let my colleagues comment as well.
Dr. Jetty.
Mr. Chairman, our objective in the Army has been to make sure that we have taken the money for 6.1, 6.2, and 6.3 and adjusted it for inflation and these inflationary factors in salaries and those type of things, and then try and make sure that we keep that at least at a level playing field. We sacrificed in our 6.4 for some time, and we have now increased, and that's one of the reasons our 6.4 budget has significantly increased. One of the things we're doing to try and get at the issue of salary disparities between some of the greater talent that we might want to reach out to is to leverage some of the authorities that you've given us: pay banding, renewable term, educational partnerships for individuals that may not want to leave full-time their university institutions. So rather than try and purely obtain the talent on a full-time basis, we can leverage other methodologies. So we think at this point that we've been able to structure our overall budget to keep ahead of the loss of talent. In fact, we think we have a good talent pool going, and particularly with some of our outreach programs, over 240 universities that we work with. We think that we're also bringing in a number of interns and direct hires. It appears at this point, though, I would say our talent pool is pretty stable and sound.
Secretary Gertz.
Yes, sir. Absolutely critical point. I guess we're attacking the overall issue from a couple different directions, which I'll kind of cover in top level and can certainly follow up in more detail, either in questions or in follow-up. The first thing is, how do we maximize the investment we have made? So $2.3 billion, while not a huge amount of growth from previous years, is still a lot of money. And so my first goal is to maximize the return and value we get for that funding. And that is through getting rid of inefficiencies in our processing, making sure we've got those funds focused on the most critical needs for the Navy and Marine Corps and for the Department of Defense. Second piece is, are we really maximizing the tools we have? Partnership intermediary agreements, cooperative agreements, other tools to bring in folks to the ecosystem. And so if I look at our numbers just in terms of CRADAs, last year we had 478. We already have 266 new ones. So we're continuing to see that rate increase. Use of OTAs have gone from 8 to 42 in 1 year. The third element is creating a clear path from discovery all the way through to deployment. And so we've reorganized the back end of our R&D portfolio to really focus on two things: future naval prototypes, which is a path in terms of getting that S&T pipelined into the programs of record so we can get it into our acquisition programs. And then also innovative naval prototypes, things where we don't have requirements yet, ideas, things we want to challenge, take high risk, and move that into the system. Creating those pipelines then really leverages that 6.1, 6.2, and these other agreements with industry to give them a clear path to the sailors and Marines we have. And then finally, it's boldly experimenting. Boldly and relentlessly experimenting in allowing that basic research, that applied research, to get in the hands of a sailor or Marine as quickly as possible. Because many times we find what they designed the technology for may not be ultimately where it has the most value into our ecosystem, and vice versa. We may not have to ask for something until we see it. That's how we're really trying to get at maximizing that investment. As we maximize that investment, we'll continue to look at adding more as the years come.
Thank you. Dr. Rowe.
Mr. Chairman, I think the Air Force has really tried to approach the Valley of Death issue with this budget. We've had great technology work going on since our inception, going on for decades. But in the collapse of the Soviet Union, we lost a peer adversary that forced, as a mandate to keep competitive edge, that forced high-tech technology into new systems. And with prototyping funding going down year after year, we've got accustomed to there being significant funding in S&T and then significant funding in program of record. So you're seeing the Air Force put a lot of its investments this year into the 6.4 prototyping fund. It's $1.6 billion to try to get things like hypersonics, directed energy, AI, out of the laboratories, into the fields, into operators' hands where they can be used. We hope that once there are programs of record in place, that creates a natural draw and demand from the S&T enterprise to keep modernizing, keep pushing the envelope of technologies, because there's a place to transition it and field for the warfighter. I expect that over time, as we get a lot of the mature technologies out of our research lab, and I would also like to recognize a lot of our important innovation partners. DARPA, SCO, and DIU are here today. We take the best ideas where we find them, and we want to make sure that we have the funding in place for prototyping to make sure that we can apply them to mission. But I expect that over time we will start right-sizing across the whole RDT&E portfolio to make sure that we've optimized for that transition. We can't transition 20 programs a year. We have to determine the number that makes sense for us to keep our dominant edge, and then right-size the rest of the S&T enterprise underneath it. But the focus for me this year is going to be transition rate. It is time to create some new programs in the Air Force, and I'm hoping we'll do that in our 21 budget request.
Thank you all. I just hope we're not going to lose sight of striking the balance. It's about optimization. I don't want to do one at the expense of the other, especially when you're talking about developing those leap-ahead, next-generation technologies. We can't eat our seed corn. We've got to make sure that we're planning for the future and properly investing in the R&D part, and along with the prototyping, getting things out of the lab and into the warfighter's hands as soon as possible. As I mentioned in my opening statement, concurrency in policy and tech development is critical to successful employment of capabilities and being a global leader and establishing norms for use of technologies. Yet, too often, policy lags behind tech development. So, to the witnesses, in your view, what actions does the department need to take to promote concurrency in policy, employment concepts, training, doctrine, and other matters as technology matures?
I guess I can start. One of the things we're trying to do on the research and engineering side of the house is to work more closely with the Joint Staff as they plan execution concepts. They need to know what technologies could be available if they want them, and we need to know how they would like to fight if we could give it to them. We've made, I would say, very significant efforts in improving, regularizing, increasing the frequency of those interactions so that as we plan the future force, we know what the people who have to fight want, and they know what we have a chance to give them. We're working very aggressively on that. To that end, in fact, just to pick one arena, in that of directed energy, we recently started a program to put a high-energy laser on a littoral combat ship. Initially, this will be a demonstration. If it works out well, we can take it to the next step. But it's time to get these systems out of the laboratory and into the field, and that's where we're going.
Anyone else care to comment?
Yes, sir. I think the way we're approaching it, to Dr. Griffin's point, in my experience at SOCOM, the faster you can get something in the hands of the warfighter, the faster you can understand where you have the real practical policy implications and start working your way through that. So efforts like our Sea Hunter, where we autonomously transited from San Diego to Pearl Harbor and back with a DARPA developed product that the Navy is now working on, is a great example. As Dr. Griffin said, getting lasers, we're putting a 150 kilowatt laser on the Portland this summer. Get it out in the hands of the fleet, let them experiment. The two other tools we use are innovative naval prototypes. Those are things that we do not yet have a requirement for, but look like they may be disruptive technologies. And we found the faster we can put them out in the field, the faster we understand where those policy pieces we need to work on or where the technology disruption opportunities are, and that's kind of our focus.
Mr. Chairman, we've done a number of things to try and address the issues that you've raised. One of them is a policy that we put in place. It's commonly known amongst us as the 60/40/80/20 policy. It gives us the freedom where you take 6-1, 6-2, 6-3 money. In the past, often you tried to find a way to link all your funding to something that you're going to do later. The later in the 6-2, 6-3, 6-4, you ended up needing a transition agreement, very formal process. So formal that what it did was it constrained our innovation, particularly at the lower levels, and our ability to look at things that might not be so clearly tied to a current operational need. In our current approach, things like 6-1 money is 100% optional. Just give me a good reason why we're doing it that might have military utility. You don't have to tie it to an existing program or a defined need. The same type of approach for 6-2 is somewhere in the ballpark of 50-50. 6-3 starts to get it closer to 80-20, and 6-4 tends to be something that we're trying to get focused against a particular outcome. This way, it gives us a little bit of a structure, but it assures some freedom on the part of the developers to be able to think outside the box and outside of the current requirements. We've done a couple of other things I think that are important. One of them is we have the Army has established the Army Futures Command. The objective of the Army Futures Command is to do a from stem to stern integration of the concept. I've got operational concepts. I'm looking for technologies, and I want the technology development community to then influence the operational concepts. So it's a spiral type of approach to coming up with new directions that we need to focus. And then when we do develop a new technology, how best do we apply that? How do we develop the doctrine, the TTPs, and who exactly does that? So that it's not just that we give them a new item. I've fielded many things. Sometimes you give it to somebody, they don't have a real good idea of how to use it. It's no better than what they had, and maybe even worse. We've instituted the Rapid Capabilities and Critical Technology Office to try and accelerate, particularly in the area of AI, hypersonics, space, directed energy, our SAP programs, to get them more under control, make sure that we know that they're focused, and make sure that they're properly resourced. And we've put, you mentioned in your discussion, how do we increase the willingness to take risk? Organizationally, people are not particularly fond of taking risk, not in the government. It's just not one of those things that's a core characteristics. So we've established a policy where we require people to put stage gates in. This comes out of something that I used in the commercial sector in a lot of work that I did. You move your highest risk to the front, fail early if you need to, highest risk to the front, then you have off-ramps at various stage gates, and if you run into a place where you found that something's not going the way you want, you can all jointly make a decision. Was it a true failure, or do we have to adjust our target? So we're putting a number of these different pieces in place to try and see if we can get at this overall methodology by which we attack these technology problems.
Thank you. Well, I think that the doctrine, the policy is just as important in many ways as developing the capabilities as well, making sure they're responsibly used. So unless you had anything to add, Dr. Roper.
I think most of my colleagues covered it, Mr. Chairman. I'll just say briefly, in addition to trying to tackle the valley of death issue and create a gradient from the lab to the field, we are working hard to turn ourselves inside out. We have to determine the right way to have an S&T enterprise in a global ecosystem. So we've made great strides over the last year, increasing our work with universities and with small businesses. But we're really focused just inside of this nation, and we should. We've got cutting-edge companies, the best in the world here. But it's going to be increasingly important to think about how do we play a role in the global ecosystem as technology is developed everywhere. If it can be developed by a country, by a company in country X, it can be used by anyone. And so we really need to focus on time to market, not technology exclusivity anymore. And that's going to mean thinking differently about how we work with universities and companies and individuals that are not in the U.S. And we're hoping to earn our way to those problems by being able to work very well with the innovators that we have in the U.S.
Thank you. I have additional questions that I will ask before we go into closed session on the condition of the labs, and also I want to talk about authorities that may be going underutilized. With that, I'll hold those and turn to the ranking member for her questions.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to keep my questions to 5 minutes so we can get to other members. My first question is for Dr. Griffin. Last year when you testified before this committee, you highlighted that there were over 500 separate artificial intelligence projects within the DoD. Fast forward about a year, the department has undergone a significant realignment of its AI portfolio with the establishment of the JAKE, the Joint AI Center, which reports to the CIO. How has your outlook on AI changed over this time period? Do you have a better understanding on what AI projects are underway, and what more can we do to accelerate the implementation and deployment of AI capability to the warfighter?
The count I offered in that hearing was based on an inventory we took at the time. I have no reason to disagree with it. I think the point of that comment is that it shows how broadly distributed the possible applications of AI and the intriguing research areas exist, and we're trying to take full advantage of those.
Let me just clarify my question. It wasn't to say, is that the number still today? It was more to say that we've shifted from having a lot of different programs to a more comprehensive approach and a joint approach in terms of how do we learn the lessons across DoD and centralize it in a hub and spoke model through the JAKE.
Okay, thank you. That helps. The Joint AI Center under the CIO has as its task the taking of research efforts which have proven to be successful or look like they could be successful in the near term and apply them to urgent or existing, I won't say just warfighter, but urgent or existing challenges of the operational community. Everything from reforming business practices to pulling targets out of ISR data to signals out of clutter, et cetera. The other focus, and I believe that Lieutenant General Shanahan, who heads that activity, working for Mr. Deasy, our CIO, I think he's all in. I think the people in the center are all in on doing this. On the research and engineering side, we have the task of bringing those tools into being. The tools that the JAKE is using are things which have emerged from quite literally 60 years of AI work, mostly at DARPA. Now, as it happens, when you move into the closed session, you have those experts with you, and I am not one of those. I'd urge you to quiz them. At the R&E level, we are trying to make sure we're covering the whole field, from research to today's applications. So that's one of the modernization priorities in the National Defense Strategy. As you may know, my deputy, Dr. Porter, and I have organized the research and engineering establishment around those priorities. The core of our organization is an assistant director for each of the NDS modernization priorities. We regard AI as so critical that the assistant director for AI will report directly to the two of us, as opposed to going through other channels in the organization. Again, the goal is so that we have right in our front office a holistic knowledge of what's going on in AI across the department, but more importantly, across the entire field, because the U.S. government expenditures in research on AI, while extraordinarily significant, are by no means the total suite of such expenditures. Let me stop there.
Thank you for that. I have 1 minute left. Mr. Gertz, shifting gears here, additive manufacturing is increasingly becoming an important transformative capability across the services, and the DoD recently announced the investment of $60 million of RDT&E in the Digital Manufacturing and Design Innovation Institute to continue to transform digital manufacturing. I believe strongly that additional investment in additive and digital manufacturing will strengthen our domestic industrial base and therefore bolster our supply chain resiliency and accountability. I have a great example of a leader in my district, Norsk Titanium. Can you talk about how additive manufacturing is transforming logistics across the department and how we can leverage those business leaders across the country who are investing in additive manufacturing?
Yes, ma'am. I'll give you a couple top-level remarks and then happy to discuss in more detail. It's transforming us both. If we have an expeditionary force. We are distributed all around the world. We have ships far away from logistics bases. We have Marines and expeditionary bases. So we have fully leveraged that to get after this logistical. We have 3D printers on ships. We have 3D printers with our Marines. We're 3D printing cement bridges. We are employing this across our entire ecosystem. And we have really, I would say, spent a lot of time on how to get certified parts and describe what parts and what families of parts can be printed locally with 3D printers and working through that whole piece. Very aggressively.
Thank you. I want to abide by my time. I'll follow up on that in the second round. Thank you. Yield back.
Mr. Larson is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Griffin, I took your advice and entered the keywords ITAR-free satellite in my favorite internet search engine, and I found a synonym, knowledge-free policy. And it gets to your point in your testimony about the U.S. removing itself from the marketplace. By withdrawing much of our own industrial base from the global market, we restrict the competitive environment for our own domestic firms, which over time has the effect of eroding the technological advantage we want to protect. Those are your words from your testimony. It seems to me that might apply to the people side as well, and I wanted to get your views on how we should approach contracting with universities or with companies, as we heard, we're contracting with companies, even if they're in the United States, that either have researchers or owners or entrepreneurs who are either from competitor countries or maybe are even second generation in the U.S. What's the approach we ought to be taking based on your idea that limiting doesn't necessarily get you the policy result you want?
Sir, that is a subject very dear to my heart, as you saw in my testimony, and we have only a few minutes to cover it. I will do my best.
We've got less than that because I have another question. So.
Yes, sir. We have to strike a balance between short-term security needs and long-term security needs. The United States got where it got, which is the world's global power still, by unfettering our innovators, by being a place where other innovators wanted to come and stay, by allowing the free movement of capital and ideas to the maximum extent possible. There are absolutely things we need to protect. I am not naive about that. I am, in fact, paid to know what our adversaries are doing. That said, we need to define the smallest possible areas around which we erect high walls in our industrial base, and for the rest of it, we need to let the competitors compete in the belief that our nation will prevail.
So if I could just stop you there, we
Yes,
tend to apply that principle to things.
It applies equally to people, sir.
Apply to people, yeah. Mm-hmm.
It applies to people. Now, I just the other day signed out a clarifying memo on how we are going to handle grants from the DoD, what we are going to know about the people who are working on those grants. That is a not insignificant topic. But our goal has got to be to attract the best and the brightest to our country and to keep them here.
You've laid out in one of your paragraphs in your testimony to address the leakage of leading-edge IP from our academic institutions. We need more counterintelligence resources. We need to educate our universities of threats of industrial espionage and ensure they employ the best practices to protect sensitive research. Does the DoD have a specific program to educate universities and other elements of academia on best practices, on counterintelligence? Are we active in that regard?
We are working that as I sit here, sir. We have a DoD-wide protecting critical technology task force led by Air Force Major General Murphy. My piece of the organization is the executive secretariat for that. We have been and will continue to have conversations with university administration about what to do and what to protect and how to go about it. While I am in favor of the maximum, of fostering the maximum amount of competition we can arrange because of the benefits I believe it brings, I equally believe that we should be very aggressive in searching out and punishing IP theft and espionage. In fact, if we stop trying to protect every single thing we might want to protect, that will allow us the resources to go after those individuals and those efforts which are targeting our IP.
So you're currently not taking a one-size-fits-all or an approach where you're cutting off universities and research 100%.
We are not doing that, nor do we want to cut off foreign student enrollments 100%. We want to look for the bad actors and deal with them as bad actors. But withdrawing ourselves from the globally competitive marketplace will, in the long run, damage rather than aid U.S. national security, in my opinion, sir.
It happens to be my opinion as well. It may not be the majority opinion, but it's
I've never been accused of worrying over much about that, sir.
Neither have I. Thank you. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Mr. Banks is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing as well. Look, with more and more of our R&D being led by the commercial sector, the challenge is integrating commercial state-of-the-art capabilities into national security systems, as all of you have already said. The department's efforts in microelectronics is a perfect example. The department's Microelectronics Initiative for National Security and Economic Competitiveness and the Trusted and Assured Microelectronics programs are focused on developing a trusted supply chain of state-of-the-art for our critical national security programs. As you know, the Indiana ecosystem is a significant contributor to that. Our Naval Surface Warfare Center, Crane, and universities like Purdue, who Dr. Roper mentioned a little bit ago, Notre Dame, and Indiana University all support these efforts. So with that, Dr. Griffin, going forward, what do you see as the role of DoD in supporting development of technology areas with national, commercial, and economic impact like microelectronics and 5G?
DoD has a continuingly critical role to play in those developments. I've been out to Crane within the last 10 or 11 months. I forget exactly what date. I was blown away by the progress they're making on things that we can't talk about in this hearing. If you pursue that same line of questioning in the closed hearing of DARPA, I think they might offer you some exciting information. But broadly speaking, the DoD has a critical role to play. However, I do have to put on the table that the issue is broader than just trusted pieces of hardware. I'm going to be careful to restrict my comments to those of an unclassified nature, and so those who've heard me offer these examples before will be rolling their eyes and saying, there he goes again, but these are unclassified examples and they're relevant. So I think 2 years ago, most people saw an extensive treatment in Wired magazine of a collateral damage caused by a Russian cyber attack on the Ukraine, which spilled over into the Maersk shipping line, and that globally important company came within one computer of losing all of their records. That one computer happened to be located in Africa and had been offline because of a multi-day power failure. So Maersk was able to reboot its system because there was one computer in their whole network that had not been contaminated. Last summer, I think everybody saw the front page news from the FBI, please turn off your router because it is necessary in order to reboot the software to get the Russians off your network. We've talked to our, I mentioned Dr. Porter earlier. She recently had occasion to talk to some of our Eastern European allies, relatively newly freed from Russian domination. They have Russians all over their network. What is my point here? The Russians aren't making and selling any hardware. Nobody's buying any Russian microelectronics. And they are still a network threat everywhere we look. So it is about the
Let me move on
hardware.
from there, and we can unpack that more in a different setting.
Yes,
According
sir.
to an Axios article published today, Chinese telecom giant Huawei is poised to claim close to half of the 5G market. AT&T CEO Randall Stephenson also stated about Huawei, quote, "You can't separate national security from competitiveness and innovation," end quote. What portion of the 5G market do U.S. companies currently have?
I don't know, sir. I can take that for the record. 5G is in its infancy. It is not. It is deployed, I think, in South Korea and on the Facebook campus, but is not. It's not a finished product.
Okay, your office is managing the DoD 5G effort, correct?
We are developing the DoD 5G strategy. Yes. Sir.
How do you synchronize all of those DoD efforts in a space that is primarily commercial?
That, of course, is the key question. And so we see as our function the enabling of commercial enterprises to help them compete in this in what is a worldwide competition. But our companies view themselves as competing with other companies, irrespective of where they're located. They don't view themselves as being in a country-to-country competition. Huawei is an established competitor at this point. AT&T and Verizon and Sprint and T-Mobile and other companies do and will want to compete successfully with them, and I think by collaborating with them in specific areas, we can help them do that.
Thank you very much. My time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. Mr. Kim is now recognized 5 minutes.
Hi, thank you so much for taking the time to come out and talk with us. This is very enlightening to me to hear your different perspectives. And it's kind of similar going off of the last line of questioning here. For me, as I'm approaching this, and we're understanding that even in the title of this hearing, we're talking about the technological edge, and each and every one of you have talked about it in that context as well. And we know that overhanging everything you're talking about is this discussion about near peers and Russia and China and others in terms of where they're at. So from my perspective here, I want to tell you that it's hard for me to understand our budgeting and the work that you're doing, if we're at the right pacing and the right levels, without understanding where that stands vis-a-vis that competitive edge. Dr. Roper, I think I really enjoyed how you crystallized it in a couple different frames here, and I wanted to just dive into that. You were talking about that competitive mindset, which includes the staffing, competing for the talent. You talked about the competitive speed, including the speed with which we bring things to the warfighter, and then also that competitive ideas that make sure that we are on that edge. So I guess I'd like to start with you and just get a sense with those three competitive categories, should we say. What is your assessment of how we stack up against the near peers, China and Russia, that is overhanging a lot of the discussion that we have today? Are we ahead? Are we keeping pace? Do we have some catching up to do? It'll help provide me with some context as I'm trying to assess the budget levels that we're talking about.
Congressman, I'll keep comments at a high level to not go into details we shouldn't discuss openly. I'm comfortable with where we are now, but not comfortable with the trend. So China has made significant advances in innovation and technology, but we're a country that's been good at it for decades. The impediment that I see is that technology development has transitioned from being mainly led by the U.S. government in the Cold War to now being developed across the world. So we have to change from being a technology inventor to a technology user. And we're not going to quit inventing technologies, but primarily we need to be able to ingest and get new technologies to market in our systems. So I think the paradigm we've got to adjust to is not being a military that has technologies no one else has or will have, but having technologies first and keep putting our hand up on the baseball bat faster and faster than any other opponent. And I like our chances because we're an innovative country with innovative universities and innovative companies to work with. We need to get everyone connected. We need to get the bureaucracy out of the way we do contracting and small business work and get moving.
No, I appreciate that. And Dr. Griffin, I'd like to go to you for your assessment here, in this unclassified setting, just to get your overall impressions of where we're stacking up.
Well, my overall impression is that overall, the United States is still the world superpower, the world leader in most technologies of interest to the Department of Defense. There are some areas where we have some catching up to do. In a completely unclassified setting, I can say go to the internet and look up the Chinese DF-26. It's a hypersonic missile that in an unclassified setting, you can see that they refer to it as a carrier killer. It's operational. It can range Guam from the Chinese mainland. That's a concern. We don't have similar systems yet. We will. On the other hand, it is often touted that because China is spending a huge amount of money on AI that they're ahead of us. They're not. Our best assessment is that although we're spending much less, we're spending it wisely, and that this is still an American province. We cannot take comfort from parity. We cannot take comfort from the fact that in some areas we're ahead. We have to recognize, and I'll give credit to Will for pointing out that much of what is going on in the R&D world today is being done commercially, as opposed to being solely the province of the national security community. So if it's in the commercial world, it's available to everyone. So we need to take advantage of that. We need to do it quickly. We need to keep up our own efforts on those areas which are not commercial. There's no finish line here. We will not maintain the national security capability that has, broadly speaking, kept peace in the world for 75 years. We won't reach a point where we own that and no one else can touch it. There's no finish line. It is a work in progress and always will be if we want to support peace and freedom in the world.
Well, I appreciate that. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. Mr. Waltz is now recognized 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for coming out today. Just to very quickly share with you, kind of, we all are influenced by how we approach a problem, right? Mine is as a special operator, spent time in the Pentagon, in the building, and then as a small business owner, where it was incredibly, frankly, painful to do business with the U.S. government, with probably about an additional 25 to 30% of overhead just to handle all of the regulatory stuff required. So I've seen this movie from a couple of different angles. A few questions. Our S&T ecosystem, I agree, is one of the best in the world. We are great. We are fantastic as a government at throwing money and resources at a problem. And just as as I look across the DoD labs and centers, dozens and dozens of these, as I look at what we've tried to do in the last few years to fix the problems in those labs by creating additional parts of the ecosystem like SCO and DIUX. I mean, how are you, Dr. Griffin, getting your mind around and getting bureaucratically, getting our arms around everything that we're throwing at this problem, from the labs to SIBRs to academia? You have stuff that's not even mentioned, like CTTSO, it's SOCOM, DARPA, all of these centers. How the heck do you know what's going on? How is that bubbling up? How are you synchronizing that that entire ecosystem?
If I have somehow created the impression that I know what's going on, please let me
I hope so.
Disabuse you of that
Because
notion.
we're asking for yet more resources to throw at it.
We are, and we're trying very hard to make sure we do understand the overall landscape and that we can address exactly the issues you've raised. I have run 2 medium-sized companies, and one of them was a GPS company some years back, and I sold, the company sold GPS navigation products to the U.S. government.
Mm-hmm.
We also made commercial handheld GPS units, and we also made survey equipment. We did not allow the survey equipment folks and the handheld commercial unit manufacturing folks to have anything to do with the people who made the missile guidance and navigation stuff, because they were contaminated by U.S. government processes, and if we allowed those two to mingle, The only practical effect
Total-
was going to be I was going to ruin my commercial company.
Right. Totally
So-
understand the problem. Just
I get your point. So to that end, sir, we have recently expanded the entire Defense Innovation Unit, its scope and its authority and its funding, because the goal of that group is to offer a low impedance approach to pieces of the commercial industrial base who could be but don't think of themselves as defense contractors. That's one of the things we're doing.
Oh, that's great. So I would just leave with you. I've a few other questions. We just have to be very careful. We do it across the government. It's not blaming anyone here. Rather than fixing a problem within our government, we throw additional pieces on top of it. So if you could just submit for the record, it's still not clear to me, SCO, DIUX, the labs, and really what they're doing better and differently. Dr. Roper, you mentioned in the last time we were here, you made a statement that I found interesting and frankly concerning as someone who's been out on the ground the last 20 years, that if we prepared for great power competition, that we would therefore, you submitted, we would therefore be prepared and continue to be prepared for counterterrorism, stability operations. I think if that were the case, we wouldn't have found ourselves scrambling post 9/11, things like JIATO, MRAP, all of those other technologies. As someone who was on the ground, we didn't have what we needed, and often what we did when it arrived, we threw it in the Connex because it wasn't what we needed. I am concerned, and I just would like to know, obviously building things that fly high, fast, and far is very different than understanding culture, language. We have special operators. I know you know this, Mr. Gertz, on the ground in 60 countries. What are we doing? We can't take our eye off that ball, and I'm concerned the pendulum's swinging too far.
Congressman, I appreciate you raising that, because I certainly don't want to imply that in a generic, abstract sense that if you're designing for the high-end threat, you're always good for the violent extremist threat. But in this case, as we think about conflicts in the future, potential conflicts in Europe or in Asia, by designing—
Keep in mind, we're still in these conflicts. As much as people would like to wish them away, and a lot of people in this town would, we're still there.
Absolutely. And Mr. Chair, I'll ask just your forbearance to answer the Congressman's question, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you, sir.
Just briefly.
So in one case, to give you an example, we're working on the Advanced Battle Management System, which is to provide support to Marines and soldiers that are on the ground, similar to what JSTARS does today. We're designing that to be able to go into areas where things are going to try to contest our ability to operate there. But we're mindful that we need that system to also be able to go into the Middle East and Africa and do mission today. So we're very mindful, if we design for the high-end threat, there has to be an offshoot for the uncontested environment. So my statement is a forward-looking statement, not a rearward-looking one. So I appreciate you asking that question, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Waltz. Ms. Houlihan is now recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for coming here today. And I think I join many of the other colleagues who came before me, including our chair, in our concern about the FY20 budget and the cuts that I think are in there for S&T and DoD-related research. Many of the technologies that I worked on when I was active duty in the military are now in the field today. We benefited from investing 20, 30 years ago, and the warfighters of today are reaping those rewards. And it's really important that we continue that sort of effort to be forward-thinking. I have 3 questions, and so I will ask the 3 of them. I believe they're mostly for Dr. Griffin, and the final one is for you all together. The first one is on artificial intelligence and recognizing the importance of the DoD relationship with industry, with universities, and research and development and the labs. My first question has to do with what you are doing to make sure that we align and better engage basic research and our laboratories and universities in supporting the advancement of AI technologies and initiatives. And so that's my first question, which relates to AI. My second one relates to advanced manufacturing. I was a entrepreneur and an engineer, and about 15 years ago I was in the footwear industry working with 3D technology, working to innovate with printing footwear using 3D printers overseas. And so 15 years later, I'm really still intrigued by supply chain improvements and initiatives that reduce costs for us, that increase our flexibility in our supply chain, and reduce our reliance on foreign manufacturing. And so my second question has to do with what opportunities exist in research and advanced manufacturing that can help transform the DoD and the industrial base, and what research activities are underway to support them to the degree that you can answer that question in this setting. And then my final question for the entire panel actually has something to do with what the chairman introduced with, which he said he was pleased to see the highest leadership here today. And I also am pleased. I'm very grateful to see you here. But what I also see is something different, because what I see is a bunch of white men. And what I'm interested in is what we are doing to make sure that we elevate people of color and women to those highest positions of responsibility, STEM and STEAM education. What sort of specific initiatives are we doing within our communities to make sure that I, as a young engineer, and now as a congresswoman, would like my children to be able to see a different face in front of me when I next see people here. So that would be my final question, and I have about 2.5 minutes if you wouldn't mind helping me with those answers.
We are actively working in AI across the entire industrial base, universities, laboratories, companies. I mentioned earlier that the U.S. government investment in AI is not the biggest dog there. So we get that, and we're working with them. With regard to advanced manufacturing, 3D printing, all of that, what are our options? I'm going to have to take that for the record. As I like to say sometimes, I'm a simple aerospace engineer from a small town, and I am not up on 3D printing and manufacturing, so we'll take it for the record. With regard to the leadership, the USD R&E Deputy Undersecretary, Dr. Lisa Porter, her name was brought up by Ranking Member Stefanik in another context. Unlike me, she's not an old white guy. And if she's sitting at home cringing now watching this, because I'd be happy to have her being here instead of me, trust me.
No, and I
So the next
completely
hearing-
appreciate that. It's, making sure that it's more than just one person that we can point at, making sure that we have a pipeline of people who look different than
Well,
who
Dr.
reflect the face of our nation.
Dr. Nikolic will be testifying in the closed session. His deputy is Mary Miller, whom you, I believe, know. She's a longtime employee. The assistant director for microelectronics is Nicole Petta, and microelectronics was raised by Mr. Banks earlier. Nicole ran a division for me in a company that I previously ran. I managed to trick her into coming to the DoD to help.
Are there
I
programs?
think we're doing everything we can.
Are there specific programs aside from specific seats that, maybe Mr. Gertz, it seems as though you might have an answer to that. Thank you, sir, for your time.
Yes, ma'am. I'm happy to bring you some more of the details. We've got a number of programs. Our Chief of Naval Research Deputy, Senior Civilian for our research is a female. But to your point, we are not going to compete and win if we cannot fully leverage diversity in all of its elements. And so we'd be happy to talk about that. We've got an Asian Pacific Partnership STEM program. We've got a lot of other ones we can describe for you. But it's an important topic.
Thank you. And if I could just have 10 more seconds, I just wanted to conclude by asking if we could, in fact, get more information about the 3D printing, and I would love to hear a little bit more about how we are engaging the universities and R&D and labs more effectively for the record, if that would be great. So thank you so much for your time.
Yes, ma'am. We'll take that for the record.
Thank you, Ms. Houlihan. Ms. Brown is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Starting on a lighter note, Dr. Jetty, great to see you. I will not report back to the Army that you used a naval metaphor, stem to stern, to talk about the approach of the Army Futures Command. Yeah, it's a joint force. I get it. So, so my question, so I also have concerns that in the 6.1, 6.2, 6.3 categories where we seem to be, underfunding. That is where we are planting the seeds for the military's future technology. In the 6.4 funding area, advanced component development and prototypes, let me ask you this. What percentage of that prototyping is done inside established systems of acquisition oversight for programs of record, and how much of that prototyping is done outside of a program of record? Any ballpark?
I do not know. I will take that for the record. If my colleagues happen to have that at their fingertips, I welcome their answer.
And the reason why I raise it, and I think Dr. Jetty, you'll be able to speak to it, is because, you know, as I understand it, the GAO has expressed a concern that when it comes to prototyping, and they were looking at the Army Futures Command, that a lot of prototyping more and more seems to be done in a relevant simulated environment versus an operational environment, and they expressed a concern that we're moving to weapon systems development at a lower level of maturity. Does that have to do with where the prototyping is taking place?
Congressman, I think that first, to give you an idea, I mean, the vast majority of our prototyping is done in a controlled approach. So there's a program manager or a lead integrator that's responsible for doing a prototype, and probably on the order of 90-10. So we try to make sure that as we're doing prototyping, it's not just willy-nilly, and that it's also associated with the program, a plan to some success if the program plan is in fact successful.
So given that it's not willy-nilly, you still have the difference between a relevant simulated environment and an operational environment. I'm sure you're familiar with the concern that the GAO expressed, and what is the response of the Department of the Army?
Well, so I think there are two approaches the Army is taking to that. First, we work very hard at trying to make our simulated environment as close to those characteristics of the actual environment we expect to see or are seeing as possible. And we have organizations specifically designed to do that, and it's part of our test and evaluation master plans that we put together. How close are we to what we need from the operational perspective to make sure that we have actually tested the equipment in an environment that's relevant? So that is a significant part of how we come up with the test plans. The second piece is that we do an awful lot of prototyping. The other 10%, in many ways, we have the Rapid Equipping Force. We answer calls from theater for various types of equipment, and those in many ways also form a variant of a prototype because they're usually small sets, certain missions, certain numbers. We go out, we study how they're doing in the actual operational environment, and then return them. I think probably the other one thing is we have a lot of partners internationally, other countries, who have various issues in their environments, and we work closely with them to try and see how they're using their innovative components early.
Let me see if I can just get one more question in. Is there a deal, and again, I always go back to what the GAO kind of recommends or highlights to Congress. Then they're recommending a high-level DoD-wide strategy that communicates strategic goals and priorities and delineates roles and responsibilities among DoD's prototyping and innovation initiatives. They claim that there is not such a strategy. What's your response to that? Is there an overarching DoD-wide science and technology strategy that delineates roles and responsibilities? And is it in writing?
I guess the best I could tell you, sir, is that from the R&E Undersecretariat, that's a work in progress.
Okay.
The National Defense Strategy has been referred to here on several times earlier. That is our guidebook for what modernization should look like. We are trying very hard across the department to reorchestrate our development portfolio in line with those modernization priorities. We are judging new programs according to whether they fit within this priority scheme or not. Not that they can't be funded even if they don't, but that certainly is a relevant fact. We're trying to realign our S&T and portfolio and right through our DT&E to fit what it is that the nation's overall defense modernization strategy supports. We're not done yet. The NDS was released 14 months ago.
And will that, and Mr. Chairman, just one follow-up. The end result, will that be a work product? Will that be a document that can be reviewed and evaluated?
I think we will be able to put together the end products from a number of these different areas and bring them to you if you wish, sir. I don't believe we're I'm not working on preparing one document which summarizes all of it in one place.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Brown. We're going to go into hopefully a brief second round, but I want to start with a question for all of you. According to the 2017 report by the Defense Science Board, most lab directors feel that they are unable to maintain their facilities and infrastructure at a reasonable standard. So I want to know, can each of you please discuss the state of your research labs and how the budget addresses concerns about maintaining the labs at the standard necessary to conduct cutting-edge research?
Chairman Langevin, I guess I will start. We have had challenges in this area. When we get military construction money, it goes for a very wide range of priorities, all of which are real, and only some of it goes to laboratories and facilities. So I've had occasion to see in my 13 months in the job so far, I've had occasion to see quite a number of facilities and laboratories which are in the process of being upgraded. I've seen many more which need it, and it isn't happening soon. I think I should stop there. It's a very difficult problem. We don't have all the money for laboratory and facilities upgrades that we would like. We're working on it.
We need to keep focused on that. We can't starve off our...
I could not agree more, sir.
Okay, Dr. Jetty?
Mr. Chairman, this is an area of concern, certainly for the Army. If you just take a look at the capitalization in the laboratory systems and the funding that's directly applied to that, we have insufficient funding to make sure that the labs remain up to date, if that's the only method by which we actually do so. One of the benefits that we have is you've given us a authorization in 2363 to tack 2 to 4% onto our research and development efforts, take that money back in, and then provide it to the lab directors to do upgrades and enhancements that are necessary to keep the lab at a cutting edge. We've fully implemented that. Took a little bit to get it past some cultural issues, but that in fact is working well and helping us. We do have a number of MILCOM projects, and I wouldn't say accelerating, but we're getting a few more per year. Picatinny has $41 million in explosive ordnance disposal technology facility. Soldier Center at Natick has $44 million in human research engineering lab. There's Aviation Missiles Center has propulsion systems lab for $30 million in 22. ERDEC has in 23 communications center for 14.8, and in 24 a risk assessment lab for 30. So we are trying to work with the labs to help them identify specific things that we can get through the MILCOM process.
Secretary Gertz?
Sir, briefly, the average age of our facilities in the labs is 61 years old. So the problem is real. It's something we've been attacking. As Dr. Griffin said, you're competing. The average age of the Navy dry docks and piers is 62 years. So, you know, there's certainly competition for it. I would like to thank the committee. You've given some additional funds in 18, $28 million, which allowed us to burn back 25% of our backlog in minor MILCON, which was really powerful for the labs, and we've taken full advantage of that. I do think there is more opportunity. We're looking at both using some of the authorities, like the 219 authority, to allow us to do some more without going through the formal MILCON process for some of the minor mods. There's probably some opportunities to relook at that authority to see if there's a little more flexibility. And then finally, we're looking at some new models. As Representative Stefanik talked about the ecosystem, it's not clear we have to wholly own every one of these facilities. If there's a way we can work with some of our partners and come up with win-wins in terms of joint research facilities and whatnot. So we're just on the front end of that. We are looking at all the available means to take on this problem, because we will not stay relevant and attract talent if we don't.
Agreed.
Mr. Chairman, I'll say briefly, I think it will always be a systemic problem that modernization of laboratories will have a difficult time competing against MILCON that's for immediate readiness, a warfighter who needs something done immediately. So I'm very appreciative of the authorities that this committee and Congress at large has given us to use RDT&E funds to do minor modernization, minor MILCON, so the Section 219 authority. We've been able to do modernizations at AFRL, about $83 million worth, that would have never made the MILCON budget. I believe these authorities are set to expire in future in 2025, so I would ask to be able to work with you and other members to either extend the authority or remove the cap and potentially raise the threshold of funding we're able to spend. I think it makes sense for modernization of facilities that do science and technology to be funded out of science and technology work. The laboratory is much more than a building. It is a factory for new ideas and technologies, so we should have a different way of working with it. Thank you.
All right, thank you all. So I'm going to have state this question, and that I'd like you, for the record, that I'd like to have you respond to that one in this last one in writing. But Secretary Gertz, you've told us that the Navy is leaning forward on FY17 NDAA Section 233, which allows each acquisition executive to waive policies and guidance of the science and technology reinvention laboratories, the STRLs, to allow for the development and implementation of alternative and innovative methods for effective management and operations in your laboratories, warfare centers, and system centers. Your letter from October 2018 mentioned that the Navy implemented 12 management initiatives, including expanded personnel authorities, revised contracting and procurement thresholds, and provided business process relief. To our knowledge so far, you're the only service to use this authority. So from you, I just wanted to ask, again for the record, what kinds of implementation have you already seen in your SRLs with these authorities? And do you have suggestions on how it and any of the authorities given can be improved to facilitate quicker development and delivery of cutting-edge technologies to the warfighter? For Dr. Jetty and Dr. Roper, I want to know what is preventing the Army and the Air Force from also taking advantage of Section 233 authorities. And then Dr. Griffin, for you finally, what can you do to better help and incentivize the services to use Section 233 and other authorities to improve lab management and operations? Time doesn't permit for us to get to that these right now in the session right here, but I want those for the record, if you please. With that, I'll turn to the ranking member for final question.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on my first line of questioning, Mr. Gertz, regarding additive manufacturing. You talked about the department's understanding of how transformative this is to many of the challenges we faced. Can you talk about how we can leverage private sector additive manufacturers and use their investments that they've made to benefit the department?
Yes, ma'am. Just as a follow-up, we have already declared thousands of parts as 3D printable certified for use. And so the first easy answer to that is then you go for the first provider who can provide that part at the best price, 3D printed from wherever they live. So I think the first item is getting the parts certified for 3D printed, getting the specifications set for those, and then allowing the marketplace to compete and build those parts for us. As I said, we're also working on the networking and the R&D aspect of it. I'm sorry, Representative left there. We've got $23 million in our 20 budget in R&D just for the research and development of 3D printing technologies, and $66 million across the FIDEP. A lot of that is so we can network all of our 3D printed files together, create models. One of the challenges is how to certify a part with a 3D printed technology that's been certified traditionally. That's where that research is going. So those are two pretty close ones. And then we're the executive agent for a 3D printing center for the government, and we're using that as well to get to practical ways to get that out. And I would comment that Dr. Jetty's policies on intellectual property and 3D also play into this.
Absolutely. I also wanted to give Dr. Roper an opportunity to comment because I know you've thought a lot about additive manufacturing and 3D printing from your perspective. Did you want to comment on my question?
Yes, ma'am. When you're waiting months, sometimes years for airplane parts, you think a lot about different ways to make them. It's making a huge difference already in the Air Force. We've certified broad swaths of parts that can be printed and put on aircraft. We're trying to go after certifying materials and machines so that even parts we haven't thought about can be made and certified and get a de facto airworthiness agreement. We created an entire program executive officer, a 3-star, that is responsible for bringing in innovation into sustainment. That's 70% of our budget, and we're not focusing innovation there. So now we're starting to do that. They've transitioned 3D printing and additive manufacturing and additive repair into our depots. They've done other innovation and sustainment initiatives like predictive maintenance, which is AI applied to maintenance. I think the thing I'm seeing, Congresswoman, is that when you're pushing the fundamental science and engineering, that's something that's not being done in the broader ecosystem. Companies are holding on to their tradecraft, and since we don't own IP in the government, we're publishing everything we're doing and are having companies come to us to try to apply technologies that we've developed to their own individual investments. And I won't say the specific companies here, but I'd be happy to share with you offline, but companies that are working on cutting-edge engines are coming to the Air Force to determine how are we printing high-temperature materials. And the reason that they know to come to us is that we publish our results. So I think the government can play a huge catalyst role in the broader ecosystem for additive just by driving the fundamental technology. And then to Secretary Gertz's point, once we have our processes and certifications in place, we should let the market do its job, which is bring our prices down and get ultimate readiness ups to the warfighter.
Thank you for that. In my minute remaining, Dr. Griffin, I wanted to go back to you. Shifting gears, I wanted to ask about 5G. You have tapped your deputy, Dr. Lisa Porter, to spearhead the initiative in your department, and there's been a lot of public debate on 5G and what should be done to contain China's global influence in this space, but little coverage on what more we need to do domestically to mature and deploy 5G technology. Can you talk about your department's approach when it comes to 5G and specifically what we need to do to jumpstart our technology to compete in the 5G space?
I'm sorry, I can answer very briefly and we can take more for the record. Yes, the R&E establishment in DoD has been assigned the lead for developing a DoD strategy, and as you mentioned, Dr. Porter has the baton for that. What needs to be understood, despite all the hype, is that 5G is in its infancy. Everywhere in the world, it's in its infancy. It encompasses both standards and hardware, and much of that is hardware yet to be developed. The so-called Internet of Things depends upon the routine use of much shorter wavelengths, higher frequencies than is in common practice today. So there's a huge development challenge. There's a huge infrastructure build-out challenge. We will need, in comparison to, as a very rough number, 10,000 cell towers in the United States today, we will need north of 10 million cell towers or equivalent base stations. So there's an infrastructure build-out challenge. What DoD and the U.S. government broadly can be part of the solution. We want to be. We think the part that we can play is in the development of some of those fundamental technologies. DARPA is the world leader in the development of millimeter wave technologies, the kinds of frequencies and wavelengths that we will need for 5G. So the technology end is one piece of it. Another piece of it is providing the testing ground, if you will, for how we're going to actually build out and deploy some of these things. Cybersecurity is going to be an extremely important part of this, and DoD can't afford to use any technology, no matter how attractive, if we can't make it secure. So offering to our developers, commercial developers, government developers, whatever, offering them the geography and the opportunities for experimentation, putting things into practice, prototype systems, without the necessity of gaining state, local, county permits to erect a tower, that could be extremely powerful. So on those fronts, broadly speaking, I think is where our ability to contribute lies. It does not, it emphatically does not lie in having the DoD take custody of a national telecoms build-out, infrastructure build-out. That's not the right path.
I wanted to just add one comment. You talked about how we can be and we want to be part of the innovation and solution when it comes to 5G. I want to add a note that I think we have to be when this is a global race for 5G technology. And as you correctly point out, the security risks, specifically the cybersecurity risks that come from 5G, it's incredibly important that we have a strategy to mature and deploy 5G technology that meets our security standards. And with that, I yield back.
Thank the ranking member. I want to thank all of our witnesses for your testimony today. I ask that you follow up on the questions I had posed at the end, and other members may have questions that they will submit for the record. I ask you to try to get back to us with those answers in a timely manner. With that, thank you all for your testimony and the work that you're doing. This hearing stands in recess and adjourned, and now going into the closed session.